One of the race favorites, Chris Froome, getting set to start the only individual time trial of the Critérium du Dauphiné presented by American Classic.
The time trial is indeed the race of truth. Chris Froome has squared off against Alberto Contador 4 times in his career. Froome getting the better of Contador 3 out of 4 times in the time trial discipline. This is the final dress rehearsal for the Tour de France coming up this summer. Almost an identical stage to what the riders will face on number 11 at stage number 11 in the Tour later this summer.
He's the first of the final 11 in the field. Alberto Contador will follow him out on course. It's the Epic Cycle Series presented by Michelob Ultra, the 65th edition of the Critérium du Dauphiné. And today, stage number 4, the only individual time trial of the race, just over 20 miles long and pancake flat in eastern France. I'm Steve Schlanger alongside Bob Roll, and this should be a terrific barometer for how things may play out at the Tour de France in just a few weeks' time. Here are the top 5 coming into the day on the general classification. They start in reverse order of these standings in the time trial, so the top riders on the GC will start last. Earlier today, the best time trialist in the world right now, Tony Martin, on course and crushing this time trial, undefeated against the clock this year and trying to win his 6th time trial of the season.
Tony Martin having a Pavlovian response, as usual, to the time trialing discipline. He's the very best in the business and sets an incredible standard, 36 minutes for 32.5 Ks, absolutely flying.
Alberto Contador next out on course, trailing our overall leader by 1:57 seconds. All of the top contenders for the Dauphiné are 1:57 behind David Velou, who will be last on course. He's the overall leader. Contador starting 2 minutes behind Chris Froome, who we just saw go out on course a few moments ago.
Alberto Contador has a real rendezvous with destiny here. He needs to do a good ride to carry some momentum against the clock into the Tour de France. Chris Froome should have a lot of confidence because he was so good in last year's Tour de France in the time trials. But for Alberto Contador, measuring himself against Chris Froome is a very important day for Alberto Contador. Chris Froome on the right, already out on course, starting 2 minutes in front of Alberto Contador.
Chris Froome already has 7 wins this season, including a race against the clock at the Tour of Romandy. That was a short prologue, however, as other riders are coming up to the finish and well behind the standard that has been set by the big German Tony Martin, who's been bothered by a stomach virus throughout the week, so he's well down in the general classification, and some wondered how that might affect his time trialing here today, but apparently he's put that aside because he's put in another terrific time that everybody else is chasing.
Very impressive ride by Tony Martin. Alberto Contador here out on course, chasing Chris Froome on the open road. Chris Froome was fantastic in the Tour de France in the time trials last year that helped him get him 2nd overall in last year's Tour.
Well, today's course, 32.5 kilometers. That's just over 20 miles long. It's a flat loop that goes in a clockwise direction, ending in a bird sanctuary in this part of eastern France.
Dead flat as a pancake. Very rarely do we have a time trial of this length anywhere in Europe that features almost no climbs at all, but it is almost identical to stage number 11 of the Tour de France. That will be 33 Ks, finishing at Mont Saint-Michel, and that is also nearly as flat as this.
The 2 time trials at the Tour de France this year, 32 and 33 kilometers respectively. Today's at the Dauphiné, 32.5, so a very good yardstick for what they'll see at the Tour. Richie Porte, Chris Froome's teammate on the Sky Squad. He's been terrific in the time trials this year with wins at Critérium International and Paris-Nice against the clock.
One of the very best time trialists in the business, comes from a time trialing background. His team captain from last year's Tour de France, Bradley Wiggins, will not be in the roster for Team Sky at the Tour, and so Chris Froome will be depending heavily on this rider, Richie Porte, who might entertain some of his own ambitions, especially in the individual race against the clock.
Chris Froome here visiting the wind tunnel in recent months for the first time in his career to help polish his time trial position. Hasn't always had the smoothest time trialing position on the bike, and trying to fine-tune a few things ahead of the Tour de France. One of his big rivals, Alberto Contador, here. Bert, as he is known, riding his 4th time trial of this season. Down in Argentina at the Tour de San Luis, he lost almost a minute to Swain Tuff in that race against the clock over 19 kilometers. Lost half a minute in just over 9K to Tony Martin at Tirreno Adriatico, and lost over a minute to Martin at the Tour of the Basque Country. So Contador has not been good in the time trials this year. However, Froome has been much better.
Froome spectacular in the time trial. It's odd to see Alberto Contador off of his form in the time trialing discipline. He's won the time trial in the Tour de France previously in his career. Presumably, Alberto Contador should be a little bit better than he's shown so far this year in the individual race against the clock. But Contador not firing in the individual time trial. That's why this stage of the Dauphiné is so very important. Bradley Wiggins using the time trial in the Dauphiné last year. An absolutely dominant performance, Wiggins, in this Dauphiné last year, and carried that momentum through to the 2 long time trials in the Tour de France that Wiggins dominated. So for Alberto Contador, it's very important that he run Chris Froome at least close and erase some of the disappointments he's had so far this year in this discipline, the time trial.
2009 was Contador's best year in the time trial. Since then, he's fallen off the pace somewhat, and really now relying more on his explosive ability in the mountains to gain time on his rivals. Chris Froome has proven to be better in the time trials over the last year or two than Alberto Contador. So we'll see if he maintains that advantage here today in the time trial at the Critérium du Dauphiné.
2 time splits out on the race course give us a chance to see how Froome and Contador and Richie Porter doing against the time set by Tony Martin. Tony Martin, a commanding performance today, rather surprising, been dogged by a stomach bug throughout the proceeding in the Dauphiné, but Tony Martin at the top of the leaderboard currently.
The reigning world time trial champion hoping to hang on for his 6th win of the season in the time trial discipline. At the finish, this is a pretty good time for the rider from Omega Pharma Quick-Step, and up-and-coming rider Michael Kwiatkowski.
Kwiatkowski turned 23 just on Sunday. Young man on the rise, 4th in Amstel, 5th in Flèche Wallonne this spring, 4th in the Tirreno, also the race leader there. That's a young man to be reckoned with on the Omega Pharma Quick-Step squad, Michael Kwiatkowski from Poland.
So far, nobody at the finish within 1 minute of Tony Martin's leading time. This man has the ability to challenge that on a good day. Chris Froome. He and Alberto Contador starting this time trial 2 minutes apart. Froome on the road ahead of the Spaniard here.
Alberto Contador, it's been a long time since he was as successful in the time trial discipline as he was during the Tour de France in 2009, beating none other than Fabian Cancellara in a rather hilly time trial, so very different than this flat one today. However, Contador has not shown against the clock in a long time. He needs to do a good ride to improve his morale and look forward to the Tour de France. And the 2 time trials in the Tour de France could concede a lot of time to this man, Chris Froome, who's proven to be one of the best men against the clock, consistent in the mountains, but spectacular against the clock when you compare him to other climbers in the sport.
Bob, if either Contador, Froome, this man Alejandro Valverde, one of the favorites, has a bad day today in the time trial, there's still a few weeks left to go to the Tour de France. How much can you improve your form in just these last few weeks? How much can you go back and reset yourself?
That's a very good question, and it depends on each rider. I think modern state of cycling, you want to show pretty well in every stage race that you do. You don't necessarily have to win, but there's very little improvement to be gained in the days between the end of this race and the Tour de France. Most of these riders, after a big effort this week, let's face it, this is one of the most mountainous Dauphinés in a long, long time, will just be resting. They won't be trying to improve on their fitness. That will happen organically, naturally, as you move forward in the season. Also, if it's one of your main objectives, it's not out of the question to be a little bit off form this week and then be at your very best at the Tour de France. And that remains to be seen throughout the year. A rider with the experience of Contador maybe has a little bit of an advantage there. He knows exactly where his form needs to be 1 week to the next, and the Tour de France is Contador's main goal for the year.
And here is Contador. Alberto Contador with just one win so far this year, and that was a stage at his opening race of the year back in January at the Tour de San Luis in Argentina. Chris Froome, who we see here, however, 7 victories already on the calendar for this year.
Dominant performances by Froome in the Tour of Oman, Critérium International, very impressive there. Critérium International from the island of Corsica a little bit earlier this spring. And many of the roads will feature the first 3 stages of this year's Tour de France.
And Chris Froome at that first checkpoint, 11.5 kilometers in, 26 seconds off Tony Martin's best time at that point. That puts him in 3rd place for the moment. However, this is now the big news. Contador over a minute behind Martin. That also puts him well behind Chris Froome.
Over 30 seconds down on Chris Froome. So far, not going well for Alberto Contador. Admittedly, these are not the type of roads that he excels on, even in the time trial discipline. Dead straight, not a lot of corners, absolutely no climbs, flat as a pancake. And Chris Froome pouring on the coals, a big advantage so far over Contador.
This is the penultimate rider of the day, Gianni Meersman of the Omega Pharma Quick-Step team, leaving only race leader David Velou of Europcar left to go in the start house now. Alberto Contador struggling, losing over half a minute in the first third of the race to one of his top contenders, Chris Froome, who's up ahead. And now this is at the finish. How about the youngster from Australia in the blue for Garmin Sharp? That is Rohan Dennis, just 23 years of age, coming up to the finish now.
Rohan Dennis setting a great time here, pushing Castro Viejo out of 2nd place. This is a great ride by Rohan Dennis, under 23, time trial champion of Australia, and having a fantastic day. This young rider was 3rd in the time trial at the Tour of California just a couple of weeks ago, still with good form. Rohan Dennis into the finishing line with a great time out on the time trial today.
And now our last of 172 riders in the field, wearing the yellow jersey since day 1. The only leader of the race so far, the French-Canadian from Quebec, David Velou. So Velou now out on course. Tony Martin, the current leader. Dennis, the only rider within 1 minute of Martin in the standings. Chris Froome leading Alberto Contador at the first split. This is Contador's teammate Michael Rogers, a 3-time world time trial champion. He's coming up to the finish just outside the top 10.
Fresh off of 2nd place in the Amgen Tour of California. Had a decent ride in the time trial there in San Jose. Not a bad effort by Michael Rogers. He'll be counted on by Alberto Contador in the mountains. That's a decent time trial ride by Michael Rogers on today's stage of the Dauphiné.
26 seconds behind Tony Martin at the first time check for Chris Froome, but putting in over a half minute into Alberto Contador at that same spot with 2/3 of the course left to go. Now, the course doesn't change much the rest of the way. How much might Froome be able to extend this advantage over Contador?
Well, if you do the math, looking forward to the rest of this bike course, 2/3 gone, that could be a minute and a half to Alberto Contador. That's a terrible disadvantage to take into the mountains at the Dauphiné, but maybe more importantly, a real blow to the morale if the status quo stays the same throughout today's stage. Alberto Contador has got to pick up the pace in the last half of this bike race.
Tony Gallipan wearing the white jersey in the best young rider category for Radio Shack Leopard. Rain Terame of the Cofidis team, who has attacked late in this race in the opening few days, now comes up to the finish line just outside the first dozen as his time goes beyond 39 minutes and still falling. And just does get into the top 15 on the number for the moment.
Can show you a little bit how fast Tony Martin was going. to take that much time out of even the top 15 riders. A very impressive ride under duress for Tony Martin, not feeling his best. Rather fearsome to imagine when Tony Martin is at his best in the time trial. We'll see if that time holds, but Tony Martin, the very best in the business. Just to get near Tony Martin within a minute of Tony Martin is a major accomplishment, and it's Rowan Dennis that's been able to do that, the only man within 1 minute of Tony Martin at the end of the stage so far.
And now at the second time check, Chris Froome has just gone through 21.5K in and a little more than 40 seconds behind Tony Martin, who had the best time there. That's good enough for third place right now. So he's lost some more time to Martin. The big question is, how far back will Contador be when he comes through?
Contador starting this time trial stage 2 minutes after the man from Sky, Chris Froome. Alberto Contador on the exact same time as Chris Froome at the start of the stage, 1 minute 57 seconds behind our race leader David Villeneuve. But at the first time check, after only 6 miles, having already conceded 30 seconds to this man, Chris Froome having a good day, Tony Martin a spectacular day, and so far Alberto Contador not a very good day. It'll be telling to see how he gets to that next time check after 21.5 kilometers, what his time is.
Back to Tony Galopin here. Now, something to keep in mind, we've been talking about the battle between Contador, Froome, Tony Martin leading in the time trial, but Tony Martin started the day over 10 minutes down in the general classification, so no realistic chance to become the overall race leader here by the end of the day. So the yellow jersey is still up for grabs. David Villeneuve, who's the last man on the course, has a shot at holding on to it because he starts the day with almost a 2-minute lead on everybody else, but there are better time trialists ahead of him on the road, so it remains to be seen who's going to be in yellow. Right now, Rohan Dennis is the virtual race leader by virtue of his finish in the TT at this point. Sammy Sanchez coming up to the finish. Could be a contender at the Tour de France in just a few weeks. The Spaniard, though, outside the top 30 here today, over 40 minutes to complete the course. That's 3:21 behind our leader.
In 32.5 kilometers, 3 minutes 21 seconds is absolutely unacceptable in professional cycling. Chris Froome pushing a massive gear and making great time. His second split just 41 seconds slower than the race leader. Here comes Alberto Contador, started 2 minutes behind Chris Froome at the start of the stage. Here he comes through the second time check, 26:42. Now that's 24:22, 2 minutes plus slower than Tony Martin. That puts him almost 2 minutes slower than Chris Froome after only 20 kilometers. An absolute disaster for Alberto Contador. In the last 10 Ks of this bike race, he absolutely has to put the hammer down to reverse some of that damage that Chris Froome is putting into Contador currently.
Sylvain Chavanel coming up to the finish. He's in the top 15 for the moment, just inside of 2.5 minutes back of Tony Martin.
Well, I'm absolutely astounded at how slowly Alberto Contador has gone through these first 2 time checks in the time trial. We're talking about 12 miles of bike racing. He's almost 2 minutes behind Chris Froome out on the open road, and that is a huge disadvantage to take into any stage of any major stage race right now. So Chris Froome doing what he needs to do, doing what we expected him able to do, and that's ride a solid time trial. Tony Martin leading the standings so far. And Chris Froome, maybe the time in the wind tunnel has paid off. He was great in the time trials at last year's Tour de France, only slower in the 2 long ones than Bradley Wiggins, but quite a bit faster than this man, Alberto Contador, so far in today's stage. 6 miles to go for Alberto Contador in today's stage, and he really needs to open it up. I don't think this is a question of tactics, saving himself for the last part of the bike race. I think he's just not having a great day against the clock.
And look at this now. Chris Froome is about to catch his 2-minute man in the red up the road, Dominic Nares of the BMC squad. At this point in the start list, the final 18 starting in 2-minute intervals. Everybody earlier started in 1-minute intervals, so this is a huge gain that Froome is making out on the road to almost catch a rider who started 2 minutes in front of him.
Impressive riding by Chris Froome. It's always good for the morale when you see the man that started the day in front of you in the time trial closing the gap now in the last 6 miles of the bike race. That is an impressive ride. All of the men in the top 20 with a chance at the yellow jersey at the end of a stage like this, and any stage race in professional cycling, great boost of the morale to be closing in on your 2-minute man this far from the finish line. That means you're making storming progress, and Chris Froome most certainly is doing that today.
Well, the most significant story of the day, though, is the blow that Froome has dealt this man, Alberto Contador. 2/3 of the way through the race today, and Froome has already put over a minute and a half into the Spaniard.
That is the sound of broken dreams. Alberto Contador losing big time to Chris Froome in a discipline that he needs to excel at to be competitive at the Tour de France.
Jürgen Vandenbroek has been top 5 at the Tour de France before, hopes to be a contender this year as well. Normally reliable against the clock, but a huge disappointment here. Outside the top 40 at the finish today, 3.5 minutes off the pace. Meantime, Chris Froome passing his 2-minute man on the course, Dominic Nares of BMC. Froome rolling along, lighting up the course on stage number 4. Chris Froome coming up to the finish now. His teammate Brad Wiggins, the defending Tour de France champion, out of the mix this year. Chris Froome, one of the outright favorites going in, just a few weeks away from what he hopes will be his first ever Grand Tour title. Now coming to the end of the time trial at the Critérium du Dauphiné, and Chris Froome into 3rd place, inside of 1 minute back of Tony Martin. That's a terrific time on the day.
Brilliant riding by Chris Froome, but hats off to Rowan Dennis, virtual leader depending on David Villieu's time, but Rowan Dennis going 10 seconds faster than Chris Froome. And for the riders that are 1:57 behind Villieu to start the stage, Rowan Dennis has done a great ride and a big step forward to perhaps getting the yellow jersey at the end of today's stage for Rowan Dennis of the Garmin squad.
Well, Bob, check this out. Richie Porte has passed Alberto Contador on the course. Porte started 2 minutes behind Contador. He's caught and passed Contador out on the road. That's unbelievable.
2 miles left in the stage. Richie Porte blowing right past Alberto Contador. Chris Froome in the finishing line now will be able to see this and know that he's done a magnificent ride against his main rival in the Tour de France, that man, number 11, Alberto Contador.
Now, Porte is good against the clock, but to pass Contador after starting 2 minutes behind, this is an incredible performance, and also says a lot about the lack of performance on Contador's part.
Well, for Alberto Contador, a lot of work to be done before the time trials in the Tour de France in this discipline. That's not a long time between now and then to make big improvements. For Alberto Contador, it's gone from bad to worse in this particular stage of the Dauphiné, the individual time trial.
Now, at the first time check, this is the general classification virtual standings. David Villieu, who came in as the overall leader, is now under a minute ahead of Michael Kwiatkowski at this particular point.
But having a minute 57 advantage, he's lost a minute and 11 Ks to Kwiatkowski. Rowan Dennis a little bit faster than Kwiatkowski at the finish line. And so Villieu has to turn it on to keep his yellow jersey. 117-second advantage to start the stage, but that is slipping away. 65th, 1 minute 22 seconds behind. That's Tony Martin's time. But to the other overall contenders, the man in yellow in danger of losing that leader's jersey. David Villieu, he's had a great ride so far in the Dauphiné, but today might be the last day in the yellow jersey for our man from Canada who's led the Dauphiné since the beginning.
Richie Porte passing Alberto Contador out on the road. He started 2 minutes behind the Spaniard. Porte has won a couple of time trials this year at Critérium International and at Paris-Nice. But he probably didn't even expect to pass Contador out on the road. And now waiting to see exactly where the Spaniard is and how far behind Porte. This has to be a psychological blow to Contador. There's no other way to slice it. Not only in today's race to be passed like this, but also looking ahead at the Tour in just a few weeks.
Absolute disaster on today's stage for Alberto Contador. It can't be an equipment issue. He has the identical equipment as Tony Martin. It's got to be a question of focus and fitness at this point in the season. It is crunch time. Alberto Contador needs to be a lot faster than this. So discouraging to see Chris Froome's lieutenant, Richie Porte, go by him with still a mile to go in the bike race, Contador is suffering now, starting to weave a little bit on the roadway. Needs to collect himself, get to the finish line. A lot of mountains to go in the Dauphiné and a couple of weeks left before the start of the Tour de France. But I'm not sure if Alberto Contador can recover from a blow to the morale that he is going to suffer on today's stage.
Now Richie Porte coming up to the finish, chasing a top 5 performance here. Richie Porte, after passing Alberto Contador, is not going to get the win, but this is going to be a pretty good time as he hits that final corner. Makes that slight left-hand bend, and just over 38 minutes in for Richie Porte, placing him into 7th. 1:19 behind our leader, Tony Martin. Alberto Contador following him into the finish after getting past Contador outside the top 50 on the day. A disaster for the 2-time Tour de France champion. And now it's a question of whether or not the yellow jersey will change hands. Our world time trial champion Tony Martin sitting comfortably in first place right now. Beginning Saturday, June 29th, NBC and the NBC Sports Network invite you to celebrate a century of brutal climbs, thrilling sprints, and unparalleled triumph. It's the 100th Tour de France. Coverage begins Saturday, June 29th on the NBC Sports Network. That is the last man on the course. In the yellow jersey, the overall leader, David Velou. Meantime, Geraint Thomas coming up to the finish, trying to stay inside the top 10. He led out his teammate Edvald Boasson-Hagen to the stage win in a sprint yesterday. And now Thomas with a pretty good effort here for Team Sky that has been terrific in the time trial overall here today. And Thomas into the top 10 on the number at 141 back.